All right. Hello again. Now today I get to introduce you to our speaker, J.R. Jamison, who is going to tell us about his writing journey, starting from writing short stories for fun and then co-founding the Facing Project, which is a national nonprofit writing project, and on to becoming a published author of young adult novels and his award-winning memoir here, Hillbilly Queer. Let's see. Besides writing, he is a host of the NPR podcast and radio show, the Facing Project, and he's also founder of the National Facing Project Network. And in case you didn't know, JR was the winner of our flash fiction contest at last year's Midwest Writers Conference. And so I thought it might be appropriate just to read just a little snippet from that, if that's okay. It's called Vintage. So I'm going to read this quickly. It's not very long. And it goes, the tattered shoebox with gold leaf edging had gone unnoticed in the depths of the Second Chance's storage. And if it hadn't been for Bobby Lane's old whiskered ear cat, Aslan, how do you pronounce it? Aslan? Yeah. Aslan, okay, who lived to be 50, or was it 5? Its contents might have been thrown out with the next day's marked down clearance. But the shoebox had called to Aslan, enticing him to paw off its lid. And when he did, age and time and fates became unimportant technicalities in Waterford, Indiana. There was no more twisting and turning to reset each day, no more years to grow old. But even still, the shoebox hadn't stopped the inevitable or the unbelievable. And we'll leave it at that. And and so now it is my great pleasure to introduce JR. I'm going to turn that spotlight or Zoom light over to JR.
Thank you very much. Good. Here, I'm going to turn this up so you can see me here. It's not the most flattering lighting, so just be forgiving on that. Thank you for allowing me to be in your space today, and thank you for that warm introduction. I'm J.R. Jamison. I don't necessarily consider myself a mystery writer or a crime writer, so when Janice and Stephen asked me to come today to talk to you, I'm like, oh, I'm not sure if this is the right audience. But they said, no, it would be great if you came and talked about your writing journey and how you ended up getting traditionally published and what that looked like. So although I don't write mystery, even though I did win the contest, as you mentioned, so I guess that has to count for something. My beginnings actually did start with mystery when I look back on it. I remember when Elizabeth encouraged me to enter the contest at Midwest Writers. We were in the hallway and she said, are you going to enter the flash fiction contest? And I said, oh, I don't write flash fiction, so I'm not sure. But if you know me, I'm kind of a competitive person and it's just part of my personality. So I decided, why not? Let me try my hand at that. And it is one of the hardest things I've written in a long time. It had to be, was it 200 words? I don't remember, 250. It had to be 250. It had to include the word golden because it was the 50th anniversary of Midwest Writers. It had to have Indiana in it. I don't remember, but there were like specific pieces that had to be in there. So I'm in my living room on the floor at night, writing and rewriting this piece. And I would be at like 254 words. And then I'm like, wait, I don't know what 4 words to get. I worked on it all night and turned it in thinking I wouldn't win. But I was really proud that I spent time on that thing. It's like part of the process, you know, it was more important than anything. And then when I found out I won, I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that. So thank you for that honor. That was exciting. It actually was a retelling of a story that I wrote when I was a kid called The Mystery in the Shoebox. So much like many of you, we're all writers here, so I don't have anything about me that's more special than anybody else. We all have our different processes, right, that we take. For me, when I was a kid, and I'm sure this might be true for you, I was making up stories long before I could actually write. I would find pictures in the house. I was bored, right? All my siblings were old. I was kind of an oops baby. So my oldest brother is 16 years older than I am. So I had teenagers when I was a toddler running around our house. And so they didn't really want to play with me. So I made up stories looking at pictures in our house, figurines, and I would make up these really dramatic long stories about them. I was lucky that I had supportive parents who would help me retell those stories when we would visit grandparents, right? Tell them about the story you made up about X, Y, and Z. They're really proud about that. And so when I actually could start to write, can you all hear me okay? Oh, sorry.
The screen didn't update for.
Oh,
I'm not
interesting.
sure. It did here, but it didn't online, so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. Oh, and it looks like I'm first. No, I'm not frozen. Eek. I
Yeah,
don't
it's
know.
weird.
If it helps for anyone, there's nothing actually written on the site. It's just pictures. So it's not going to prohibit any learning today, if that helps. Unfortunately, you'll just be able to see my face stuck on the first one and not fun pictures of me growing up in awkward stages of my life. So for those of you at home, I apologize for not being able to see this, but there are no words. So you're just listening to me speak. So anyway, I would make up these stories and then I would start to write those stories once I could actually write. And my parents encouraged me to do that. So when I was in about second grade, I wrote a story called The Mystery in the Shoebox. I was a fan of fantasy at that time. I was a big Teddy Ruxpin kid. So Teddy Ruxpin had the land of Grundo. I don't know if any of you remember that, but there was a map that you laid out and you could look at the different communities within the land of Grundo. And again, I would make up stories about this. So I made the decision when I was a kid, I'm going to write a mystery story called The Mystery in the Shoebox. So I worked on that and I reworked that and reworked it as I got older. And then when I was in the fourth grade, I could enter the Young Authors Contest, right? I was so excited about that. So I entered the Young Authors Contest 3 years in a row and lost miserably every single time to stories that I thought were very subpar. But anyway, it made me not want to continue writing. It really was deflating as a kid. And I think the hard part was I didn't have people around me who were telling me that rejection's a part of this process. So I did the unfortunate thing, and that was I stopped writing until I was about a junior in high school. Of course, I wrote papers for school and different things like that. But then I picked up poetry when I was a junior in high school, really angsty teen poetry, if you can imagine, right? Just that really sappy, sad stuff. That's me on the far left. Sorry, those of you who home can't see. I was a bit of a hippie and they can see that one. Okay. I was a bit of a hippie and just was really into teen angsty writing. And so I decided once I got back into poetry that I wanted to study writing in college. And so I went to Ball State University, and Ball State did not offer creative writing as a major, only a minor at that time. So I majored in geography, minored in creative writing, and really started working on poetry. But while I was there, I met a professor, Barbara Bogue. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Barbara. You're familiar with Barbara. Barbara was a short story writer, and Barbara got me interested in short stories. What's nice about poetry translation to short story is it helped me be lyrical in my writing, but also expand it into prose, which was kind of new to me after giving that up from being a kid and writing The Mystery in the Shoebox. So I really spent most of my time doing short story writing. But I had mentors who were kind of steering me away from writing, saying it's really hard to make a living in writing. And so you really need to think about a different career. Well, because I like geography, I thought, well, maybe I could be a travel writer. So I spent some time in Asia. I studied abroad in China, started making my focus travel writing, writing about place and experience and connecting my geography degree to that. And that got me more into descriptive writing, right, which connected to some of my other forms that I enjoyed. But you know what the saddest thing of all is? When I graduated from college, I didn't realize because, again, I didn't have people who were telling me, I didn't have my people around me who were telling me, what direction to take this. I didn't realize to be a travel writer, you really have to freelance. And before you get any big gigs, and guess what? There's not really a lot of money in that either. So I ended up joining AmeriCorps and enjoyed my AmeriCorps experience doing literacy programming with K through third grade students. Still kind of fed my need around writing and reading. But at that time, I had a mentor who then said, I think you really should go into student affairs and higher education. I think you have a knack working with students and mentoring them. And so that's what I did. And I spent 10 years after that not writing a thing because I got busy with career, I got busy with life, I got married, just lots of things that were happening in my life, and writing took a back burner. I would sometimes get ideas, but then I was too exhausted to even write about them. And so I didn't. So I gave that up. But in 2011, I met Kelsey Timmerman. Some of you may know Kelsey if you're connected to Midwest writers in any way. Kelsey is a New York Times bestselling author. He writes nonfiction, traveled around the world, lived with people who make our clothes, make our food, grow our food, and he tells their stories. Well, I was working for an organization called Indiana Campus Compact, which was down here in Indianapolis. And my boss handed me this book called Where Am I Wearing? That was authored by Kelsey Timmerman. And she said, I'm thinking about bringing this guy as a speaker to our conference. Would you read his book and tell me whether or not we should bring him, right? She wasn't going to take the time to read it. So I went home and I read it over a weekend. And as I'm reading it, I realized this guy lives in Muncie, which is where I live and where I was living at the time. So when I get back to work on Monday, I told my boss, I loved this book. I think we should bring him. And he also lives in Muncie. So if we can connect to him, I'll see if he wants to do coffee with me and we'll talk about it. So that happened. And I reached out to him and he said, yeah, let's have coffee. So we talked about his writing and et cetera. And he said, hey, I'm actually working on this project idea I have here in Muncie called Facing Poverty, where I want to place writers with people who have a story to tell, but maybe they don't have the means to tell their story because they can't read or write. And he said, what would you think about being a writer on that project? And I was excited about that, but at the same time, I was nervous. I hadn't written anything in almost 10 years. But I said yes. And he partnered me with a woman named Pat. And I walked into that first meeting with Pat at IHOP in Muncie, and we took a corner booth. And I wanted to run because she was an 80-year-old woman who had many probably different experiences than I had as a person. And how was I able to carry and tell her story? But I couldn't leave. We were stuck in this booth in IHOP, right? And that would be rude of me to say, I'm sorry, I'm just not interested in telling your story. That wouldn't be helpful. So Pat and I sat and talked for 2 hours, and she asked me questions about life in Muncie. I asked her questions. She really turned the tables on me. She said, no, get rid of your interview questions. I came in prepared like a journalist. She said, get rid of your interview questions. Let's have a conversation. Luckily, I had a recorder, so that helped because I could go back and listen to our conversation later. But I learned things about Pat in that discussion that I wouldn't have learned had I stuck to my questions. And it really shaped the way that we do our work at the Facing Project, what then became the Facing Project. But at that time, it was just Facing Poverty. So I wrote Pat's story. I was one of 20 writers in that project who went through a similar experience. We brought the stories to life on stage. We created a booklet, shared it throughout the community, and started a conversation in a deeper way about poverty in Muncie and what our statistic meant beyond a statistic, but really what were the lived experiences of people that are varied in the community. The magic that I saw happen around that writing process between writer and storyteller, and my own experience too, I'm like, there's something here that's bigger than just this one project. So I said to Kelsey, what would you think about us talking to other people who would maybe want to use this model? What would that look like? So we played around with it. And that's what ended up becoming the Facing Project. The Facing Project has now grown into over 100 different communities now globally, where people are using that very simple model of picking a topic and people sit down together and work together to write each other's stories. So I ended up focusing all of my efforts on nonfiction writing. I got back into writing, but I got away from poetry. I got away from Mystery in the Shoebox and got away from travel writing, but started writing real stories from the voices of other people. And I'm like, this is really fascinating. I'm learning things about people. I'm also learning brevity on writing these 700 to 1,000 word pieces. I pulled in some of my poetry writing because I like to be lyrical in my style. So it was kind of, it filled all of my buckets, and I still had my full-time job that was paying me. So it was like, okay, this is all right. I'm enjoying this. So Facing Project continued to grow, and it grew quite rapidly, faster than we ever thought. By 2016, it was in over 50 communities at that time. And we were being asked to go on the speaker circuit. Kelsey, because of his book and its notoriety, he was already doing a lot of speaking gigs, but he would start talking about Facing Project. People were interested in that. So then I got pulled into that mix. So we were going around talking about the work that we were doing at Facing Project, and one of the speaking engagements was in Iowa, and the editor of the University of Iowa Press, I think it was University of Iowa, or Iowa State, University of Iowa Press, was at our talk. And she came up to me afterward and she said, "Have you ever thought about doing a book about the Facing Project?" And I was like, "No, I don't even know what that would look like." Because right, we're working with so many different writers. Like, would it be a compilation, an anthology of different stories? What would that look like? She said, "Well, here's my card. Give me a call when you're back in Indiana. I'd love to talk." So Kelsey and I called her, and we're all of a sudden in a meeting with an editor of a publishing house, a university press, but a pretty big university press. And she said, I want to do a book. What are your ideas around it?" And so she had some ideas she was throwing around. And her idea was, well, what if you took some of the stories from past Facing projects? We would give byline credit and everything to those authors, but you two would also kind of tell your story about how you got here and how empathy is a big part of the work that you do. And so based on that, you need to dig down deep into your past and think about what is it about your upbringings that brought you to this work of writing and empathy, that crossroads. I was absolutely thrilled about the idea, and Kelsey was not. He was traditionally published through Wiley, and they were not offering an advance at the University of Iowa Press. There were things that were issues that he was contractually obligated to with Wiley, where they had to have a first basically pass or whatever as they call it. And so he was like, "I'm not sure how this is going to work with Wiley. Plus, I'm not super excited about the University of Iowa Press because I don't know about their reach. I don't know if that's the right space for us. Is it really time for us to be writing a book about this?" But he was like, "Let me talk to Richard, who is my editor at Wiley." Next thing I know, we're in a meeting with Richard. And again, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And suddenly I'm in this meeting with this guy from Wiley. And we're pitching the book to him, kind of using what the University of Iowa person told us, like, this is kind of an idea of what it could be. And he and I had sketched it out a little more. So it wasn't like we were stealing her idea totally, but we were mapping it out on what it would look like. My piece that was my personal story would be my relationship with my family. I grew up Southern Baptist in a farming community. I had 40 people in my graduating class, and I was quite different from everyone else in my community. And I am gay. And when I came out to my family, it was quite stressful for them for a variety of reasons. They still loved me, they showed love, but they were also worried about what the community would think about them. They were worried about what the church would think about them. They were worried about my safety. There were lots of swirling things happening, and we worked through that process. And so that was part of my story that brought me to trying to understand a cross difference that connected to the Facing project. So that was part of our pitch to Richard. And so he sat and he listened to our pitch and said, yeah, I'm not interested in that book. And he said, "However, JR, I am really interested in this storyline that you have around a relationship with your family, particularly your dad. So if you ever flesh that out, give me a call." So I was like, "Oh, wow, okay." I didn't have it ready to go, but it was 2016. And at that same time, my dad said, "Hey, do you want to go with me to my high school reunion in rural Missouri?" We all remember what was happening in 2016 at that time. And my parents are somewhat politically right-leaning and conservative, and they were excited to vote for Donald Trump, and they just thought he was going to be the greatest thing for the United States. I did not have that same feeling. So we were having some clashes there. And my dad said, "Do you want to go on this trip with me?" And I wasn't sure if I did, but I thought it was the most radical thing I could do. If I was encouraging people to tell their stories from the Facing Project, I have this editor at Wiley who's saying there could be a story here. I thought maybe this is the thing. Maybe this is like the universe, right? Telling me these are the things to do. So I said yes, and I went on this trip with my dad. And when I came back from that trip, I had a lot of material in my head. Because I'm a writer, I'm sure y'all can relate. I took a moleskin with me. I had lots of notes that I had jotted down, observations, reflections that I was making along the way. And I came back and I thought, I don't have a book. I don't know how to write a book. I'm not a novelist. I'm not a memoirist. What do I have here? So I thought, well, maybe I have an essay. And so I started playing around with that. And I realized I had so many essays that I could write that I thought, what if I start piecing this together? It could be a book. So I did start playing around with the first draft of that. And Kelsey again, because we're good friends, we were doing work on Facing Project, he said, I think you should take it to Midwest Writers and you should pitch it to an agent. And I was like, oh, I don't know about this. I don't know how that will work. But I did. And I was so nervous. Let me tell you, when I was standing outside of that room, I was sweating. I was like thinking through my head everything I was going to say. And of course, when I sat down, I said none of that stuff that I was thinking I was going to say. And to my surprise, the agent said, I want to see the entire manuscript. Send it to me. And I was like, oh my God. So I sent it to him afterward. I was thinking, this is it. Wow, this is really becoming a book. I'm going to get published. And then I never heard from the agent ever again. So I spent 4 months because, again, I had no idea what I was doing. And so I kept sending him follow-ups every 3 or 4 weeks for 4 months to say, hey, I'm just checking in. Any update on the book? What do you think about it? Nothing. No response, anything. So after 4 months, I kind of thought to myself, okay, well, maybe this isn't going anywhere. What do I do? So I had to make a decision. Do I want to just go back to pulling out essays and maybe publish an essay? Or do I want to run with the fact that I've put together a book and try to get it published? And what's the right outlet for me? Do I independently publish it? Do I try to go after other agents? Because I had one that was interested, maybe others would be, right? Just trying to decide what I wanted to do. And ultimately, I felt like if that one agent, even though he ghosted me, had an interest, there was something there that maybe I could pitch it to others. So I started doing research on memoirist agents and what that would look like. So I put together a huge spreadsheet around that. And I spent about 7 months pitching 93 different agents, a few here and there on Saturday mornings. And I got a lot of rejections. I got 10 full manuscript requests. About half of those ghosted me too. Never heard from them again after I sent the manuscript. The others, very polite rejections. The story felt too quiet, which really means they want more drama in it. Or the story felt too dragged on, too long. So I took some of that suggestion and took another look at the story, did a couple redrafts, continued to pitch it out. And I finally got one agent who wrote me back after 93 agents I'd gone through, Julie Stevenson, who is now my agent who represents me. And she said, I want to see the full manuscript. Would you send it to me? Well, I'd already had 10 others who did that. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to send it to her, but I'm going to get ghosted again or a polite rejection. She actually emailed me back that night and she said, I want to schedule a phone call with you. And what I did not know, which I now know, if an agent tells you they'd like to do a phone call with you, that's a big deal. That means that they're this close to signing you. You just got to seal the rest of the deal while you're in that conversation with them. So I'm on this phone call with her, and of course, I'm a nervous person anyway, so I have nervous energy. So beforehand, I'm running through everything in my mind. What am I going to say? So I get on the call with her, and there were just so many things that were connected in our lives. She grew up in a small rural community in Montana. Her father also was a little conservative leaning, so she got the story. She had ideas for it. She didn't feel like it was totally ready yet, but she had some ideas for rewrites. So I ultimately agreed to sign with Julie, and we spent 6 months rewriting my memoir, which is now Hillbilly Queer. Some of those were hard things as a writer that it was hard to hear. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 just don't do anything. So just get rid of them. But we got to make up the word count. So write new material, right? So those are things that as a writer, I was like, am I okay with this? But it's an agent. It's really, I should follow her lead. So I ultimately decided to do that. And so we rewrote the book, kept some of the original content, obviously, but rewrote some new chapters. She wanted me to mine a deeper vein, language she likes to use, which is go deeper in some of these stories, right from the pain. And so I did that. And again, I wrote a few more essays around that pain and then thought about how they're peppered throughout the book. So then we get to the big day of submission. And if you go on submission, if you've ever been with an agent, I don't know if any of you have gone through that process, but it's nerve-wracking because you really, as the author, then are out of the equation. The agent tells you, and in this case, Julie said, I have 15 editors from imprints of the big five that I'm going to send your book. I will keep you updated as we hear from them. So she told me it could be a matter of days or a matter of months before we heard anything. And just while you're doing this, do something else. Think about something else, but you're really out of this equation at this point. So I patiently waited as the rejections rolled in, and every one of those editors rejected my memoir. And that's like painful too, right? You go through that process and you're like, I thought I got to this moment. And then all of them said, yeah, no, we don't like this book. So where do you go from there? And so I said to my agent, do we go out to independent publishers? What does this look like? And she said, I actually think that we need to rewrite the book again. But I think we need to rewrite it as a nonfiction proposal, and that it should salvage parts of your memoir, but it should be a stunt book. And I don't know if you're familiar with stunt books. Stunt books are where you go out, similar to what Kelsey does in his books. You go out, you meet people, you write about their experiences connected to your own. So that would be a book a little bit about my life and with my dad, but also other people who are living on that political divide and how they were navigating relationships with friends and families. And I was kind of excited again about it. I was like, okay, I'm a little sad that the memoir didn't go where it needed to go, but we have a new idea. So we spent 6-7 months working on a proposal, reaching out to people to make connections to people who I could then interview. The idea was my dad would go on the road with me too. He and I would be sitting down interviewing these people. And we had titled the proposal Somewhere in the Middle. That was going to be the name of the book. And you know what? We went on submission on February 28th, 2020. And I was so excited about it. But what do you think happened a week later? Everything closed down. And so within that first week of going on submission, we heard from 2 editors who said, I love this proposal. I'm still reading, but I'll be back in touch soon. So Julie said, that's a good sign, because if an editor says that, that means that they're probably serious and they may want to do a call. And then 2 days later, I get an email from her that says, I don't know how to tell you this, but because everything is closing down, no editor is going to pick up this book, a book where you have to travel around and meet with people. And I was devastated. I was crushed. I had spent all this time reworking this thing. And then I didn't have anything else I was working on. So I thought, is this the end of my relationship with her? Is this the end of my memoir? One thing we were doing at that time at the Facing Project is that we had created a publishing arm called the Facing Project Press, because we were publishing books for our communities who were doing projects. We were already talking as a board about picking up narrative nonfiction or memoir that connected to our mission, but we hadn't yet put together all of the requirements and a submission call out or any of that. But Kelsey said, why don't we just publish your memoir that you've worked on, the original one, like the one that you reworked with Julie? Why don't we just publish it through the Facing Project Press? What do you have to lose, right? I was like, I don't know. Is this bad? So I talked to Julie and I said, okay, listen, I don't have anything else I'm working on. I know this new proposal is dead in the water. But what if I publish my memoir through the Facing Project Press? Is that career suicide? Like, am I going to be committing some kind of, And she was like, no, but I'll actually help you set up the contract. So that way it could be considered a traditional type of publishing. So she worked with me on developing a contract that we will use now with future authors that we acquire through the Facing Project Press. And she also helped me when the book came out, get it placed in different review magazines, like Forward Review magazines, which does independent reviews, reviewed the book. So she helped me put it out in the market, as she said. I don't regret self-publishing. I mean, it's pretty much a self-publishing, let's be honest. Like, I was kind of the editor too on that. So I don't regret doing that at all, because it actually sold quite well. We got it out in the market. I was excited that people were connecting to the story. And she still was willing to stay on. She basically said to me, if you have a new project in mind, bring it to me and I'd be willing to look at it again. But like, this isn't the end of our relationship. Just let me know when you're working on something new. So I focused my efforts on promoting the print version of Hillbilly Queer and getting the book out there. And one thing that was helpful is I did in conversation events with other authors. And I'm a person who says, shoot your shot, right? Like the worst somebody can say is no. So I was reaching out to people like Ashley C. Ford, these big name like authors. I'm like, hi, would you be willing to blurb my book? Hi, would you be willing to do an in-condo event with me? Because they're people too, right? Like they go to bed at night just as I do. So the worst they could say is no. I was surprised so many of them said, yeah, I'd be willing to do an in-combo with you. I don't know you, but yeah, let's do it. You tell me what bookstore it's going to be at. And if they set up the Zoom, I'll be there and we'll have a conversation. That really helped because then the book was getting out into their communities and they were promoting it. So that helped spread the word. What happened about a year after the book came out, and it sold around 1,000 copies in print, which some people, if you're a traditional publisher, would say, oh, that's awful. But if you're an independent publisher, that's pretty good. So Julie said, I think, because we kept the audio and TV and film rights for the book, because she said, quite honestly, Facing Project's not going to be able to do an audiobook or TV film rights on this. So I think when we negotiate the contract with their board, we keep those rights and I can exploit them later if the book takes off. So about a year after the book was out, she said, I want to exploit the audio rights. Spotify has created their own imprint called Orange Sky, and they're grabbing books left and right to make audiobooks, backlist titles. So she was like, I think this is a prime opportunity. So that was helpful to have her then as an agent because I could not go to Orange Sky Spotify on my own. I had to have an agent to do that. And she sold the audio rights to the book at auction. So there were other imprints that she'd gone out to, audio imprints, and if Spotify wanted it, they had to ramp up the price on that to be able to get the audio rights. So they bought the audio rights to the book. The audiobook came out in February of 2023. She worked with them to get me to voice the book. At first they were like, we have our own voice actors, and she really fought for me to get that. And I had to audition for it, which is crazy. But I ended up getting the part for it. And so I did the audiobook, which was a lot of fun. And there were things without her that wouldn't have happened. So for instance, she was able to get on Library Journal's radar, and they ended up doing a starred review of the audiobook. It ended up becoming one of the best audiobooks of 2023. They only chose 10 nonfiction titles in 2023, and they picked my book, which was like crazy. So what I always tell people, this is a story of stick-to-itiveness. It's a story of, I self-published it, but I wasn't willing to just put it out there for a few people. I was going to fight left and right to feel like my story was just as important as somebody else's who was published by a big five, that then ended up helping me in the end for the audiobook coming out. I will tell you though, even though the audiobook spent 2 weeks on Libro FM, which is essentially the audio version of for independent book publishers, yeah. I spent 2 weeks on their bestsellers list and it made the Library Journal's best audiobook. I've not made a dime of any of the royalties. So don't get your hopes up about that. The hard part about that, I mean, other than my advance, so I'm happy that I got that, but I'll never earn out that advance for it. So the hard part is with audio, if you have an audio deal that's separate from your print deal, typically if like a big five publisher does pick up your book, they buy the package, right? Like they're doing the audiobook and they're doing the print book for you. In this case, I independently published the print book and then just happened to be able to exploit the audio rights. Audio rights typically don't pay in advance, but because I had an agent, she was able to strong arm them into doing that. But because audio works in different ways, similar to streaming, where there are different subscription services, they're selling it at different price points. There are credits that are given out. It's really hard to track your sales numbers on that. And so Orange Sky and Spotify can say, well, we know that it spent time on bestseller list, but we can only pinpoint that it sold 126 copies. And they only get so much of that money from the different subscription services, and then I only get a percentage of that money. So I actually got my royalty report the other day, and it was like, well, but I'm okay with that. But I'm just saying that too, if you happen to want to exploit, if you're working on independent stuff getting it published, and then you want to try to exploit audio rights, just know that going into it, that you may get a lot of like awesome fanfare, that's cool things that you can be like a feather in your hat, but also don't expect like a lot of variety and that you're going to make much money off of that, just to be completely honest. I will say throughout all of my experiences with publishing, it's all connected. So even when I was a kid working on mystery writing that moved into poetry, moving into poetry helped me truncate my writing and be a little more focused, a little more lyrical. Moving into short story writing was helpful because, again, brevity around that and helping create a narrative in such short amount of words. And then moving into travel writing helped me be more descriptive in the work that I did to describe place. And then when I started doing facing projects and having to sit down with other individuals to understand their lived experience, that helped with character development because I started to meet people from all walks of life who I would have never sat across from before to say, tell me your story about your lived experience. And it's not my time to say, well, actually, like, I have something similar. No, my job is just to sit and listen and not say one word. It's their time to talk and for me to work with them to put that story in the page. And that helped me so much with dialogue creation. It's helped me so much, like I said, with understanding the stories of others that I can tie into characters that I'm working on in other work. So even though I kind of have a bit of genre bending happening in the work that I do, it's it's honestly, it helped me write my memoir in the way I did. I've had people say to me when they read Hillbilly Queer, it feels different. It feels like I read a novel and not a memoir. And I'm proud of that. I think that that is important. People should walk away from any story and wonder if it's real, if it's memoir, if it's fiction. That's the beauty of words and the beauty of language. I'm often asked, so now what? And this is my machine that helps me disappear from the world. It's my please don't bother me, I'm thinking machine. No, really, it's an eye massager because I have migraines. But I'm writing more young adult. And so I just finished my first young adult novel and we're going on submission. I sent it to my agent and I said, okay, you said when I'm ready for something else, to let you know. Well, I've written a young adult novel and she had signed me as a memoirist, right? Is this a deal breaker? And she said, no, it's not at all. Let me take a look at it. And so she read it and she wanted changes. So we worked for a year on changes on that book and we go on submission on Monday, like this coming Monday. So I got to go through that process all over again. And it may not get published. I don't know, right? It may end up failing, or maybe we'll have editors interested and they may want to have a conversation. And then in that conversation, they may say what Richard said to Kelsey and me all those years ago in 2016 when he said, yeah, actually not interested, right? So I'm preparing myself for that, but I feel like the journey I've been on has got me to the point where I'm ready for that rejection because ultimately I'm a writer. And what matters most to me is not any accolade that comes along. It's not if somebody says to me that my writing is worthy enough to be published by them. Writing helps me heal. I've seen it help other people process their thoughts as well. It's a way that I can get my feelings and thoughts on the page and it helps me make sense of the world. And so I will always write, regardless of what happens. So next week could change my life in a different way, or it could go nowhere at all. And I'm okay with that. And it goes back to my beginning and the story that you started with that I want to share, which was the piece I wrote for Sisters in Crime. Because I think it says a lot about the writing life. So as I read this, I want you to think about your own journey in writing and how it can go any which way, and we never really know. So even though this is kind of a mystery piece connecting back to the story I wrote when I was in second grade, and then when Elizabeth said, enter this contest, I was like, I don't know. And I'm like, what if I retold this story that looking now as a 45-year-old seemed very childish. How can I rework it as an adult into something a little different? So think about your own life as I'm reading this. Vintage. The tattered shoebox with gold leaf edging had gone unnoticed in the depths of the second chance's storage. And if it hadn't been for Bobby Lane's old whiskered-eared cat Aslan, who lived to be 50, or was it 5, its contents might have been thrown out with the next day's markdown clearance. But the shoebox had called to Aslan, enticing him to pull off its lid. And when he did, age and time and fates became unimportant technicalities in Waterford, Indiana. There was no more twisting and turning to reset each day, no more years to grow old. But even still, the shoebox hadn't stopped the inevitable or the unbelievable. First, it got Bobby. His mousy brown shag had turned gray and then white and back to brown. And poor Miss Jenny, who shopped to find replacements for her china sets, had shrunk a foot and then three until all that was left was a shrill echo under a wicker hat and a pink pattern dress. And Aslan, he had grown big and then small and turned white and then orange until it repeated over and over, and he turned to dust. In what may have been a year or even only a minute, the whole town had aged up and then back down. How much for this? A young man said, pointing to the shoebox that Bobby had covered with a masking tape label to read, "Secret Finds." Nothing but time, Bobby said, and that's free. Thank you for allowing me again to be in your space. Again, the story I think speaks to me in a way that there are ups and downs in writing. And sometimes in our writing, we get so much into it that so much time has passed. But we always have the opportunity to start over in our writing too. And so it's a journey. It's a journey that never ends, and it's a journey that's full of mystery. So thank you, and I'm here to answer any questions that may be helpful. Just thank you for allowing me to share a bit of my story. Yeah. Well, I do have 2 books to give away. So the first 2 people to ask a question gets the book.
So, your family were Southern Baptists. Are they still Southern Baptists?
Yes, absolutely. And they still go to the church that I went to when I was a kid. That's an interesting question. So in 2020, my mom still voted for Trump. My dad did not. And he said a lot of this experience of going on the trip with me and the book that I wrote actually helped shift his perspective on the way he wanted to vote. My mom, though, was still pro-Trump all the way. Now, moving toward 2024, I've sat down with my parents and walked them through Project 2025. And if you're not familiar with Project 2025, look it up. It's quite terrifying. And it sounds dystopian. Might sound like something you might work up, but it's absolutely real, and it will alter and change the future of our country. And I walked my parents through it, and I said, if you vote for him again, this will disappear me as a person, who I am and who I believe, how I live my life, right? So they absolutely are not. My mom was like, I will not vote for him again, and my dad won't either. So that's kind of a long answer, but why I say it's complicated and interesting is they still are very much conservative Republicans. That's not going to change. I'm not going to change that. I'm not going to try to change that about them. That's who they are. They know my lived experience. I know their lived experience. But politics are weird. They're messy. They tear families apart. I think they can bring families together if people are willing to sit down and have honest conversations and listen to one another. So with my family, it doesn't mean that we have to always agree. I know that they accept me for who I am. They're very clear about that. My mom is way more proud sometimes than I am. She's quick to tell people about her gay son. So there's a lot of nuance in that. It's weird, right? Because you would think on that level, like she wouldn't vote the way that she does. So it's a complicated question, but I will say though, after walking them through certain things, they won't. However, now they're on this Bobby Kennedy Jr. thing, and I'm like, oh no, I'm not sure that's the right one either, Mom and Dad. But what do I do? I at least kind of moved you over in this direction a little bit. So yeah.
About the church.
Mm.
I mean, I used to go to a Southern Baptist church.
Mm-hmm.
It was not particularly conservative Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
Are there, are people in the church accepting their view?
I don't go to the church, so I'm not a religious person at all. I had a lot of religious trauma that I had to unpack, and a lot of it's in my book, if you read it, that I walk that path. And I just have no interest. My parents for so long would say to me, like, oh, you should come to church on Easter. Why don't you come to church with us on Easter? Because I don't want to. I'm an adult. Like, why don't you not go to church on Easter? Come hang out with me at my house. Well, no, we have to go to church, right? Like, so we all have live our own lives. So they can go do their thing and I go do mine. And I don't go back to that church. I have talked to them about the pain that I experienced in that church. And I think it's hard for them to wrestle with that because they're aware of it, but it's also their faith home where my mom grew up in that church, right? And then when she married my dad, she brought him into that church and they raised their family in that church. And so it's not so cut and dried for her to just be like, yeah, I know there's so much pain here for you. And these people here don't accept you, but I have to go. I have to keep going because it's my faith home. You know, like there's so much gray there. It's hard to, yeah. But long story short, no, I don't go to that church. I don't have plans to ever go back to that church. Yeah. I'm more of a, you could call me a Wiccan or a witch, or I'm more into the powers of the universe, which, you know, some people may think that's crazy too, just like I think my parents' church is crazy. Yeah, right on. Oh, sorry, there was a question there too. So I don't know, like you'll have to fight over who gets copies of the book. I'm sorry, I only brought two. Did you tell her to?
What is your YA book about, and is it going to end up in the banned bookshelf?
Probably. So my book is so what I can tell you about the book is that it's set in 1997 in Indiana, and it's about a teenage boy who's sent away to conversion therapy by his family. And while he's at conversion therapy, he meets a girl there who is at the conversion therapy camp for all the same reasons. But she's a little more worldly, a little more rough and tumble. And he confesses to her that his best friend had run away from home and is living in New York. And she was like, well, let's get out of here and we'll go find her. So they escape the conversion therapy camp, make their way to New York, where they find his best friend. And they all work at a Chinese restaurant by a man who basically takes in all the gay kids whose parents have thrown them out, and they've made their way to New York. And it's a coming of age tale that's about friendship, about what defines home. Is it geography or is it the people we meet? And so it's hopeful, it's sad, but it's hopeful. And that's what the book is. So we'll see. The working title is called Miles from Nowhere. Yep. Yep. Sorry, I know there were two more questions.
That was my question.
Oh, okay. Oh, are you sure? Nobody else has any other question? Anybody at home? It was not, but you know, and I'm sure this is true for all of you, but when I write fiction, I do pull from lived experiences. So even though Ray, who is the protagonist in the story, is not my story, I've known people who have gone to conversion therapy. I've done a lot of research into that. There are parts of Ray's personality that are absolutely part of my personality. So it's not my story, but it's adjacent.
You know of anyone that conversion?
No. Absolutely not. Yeah, no, I have not. And in fact, the American Psychological Association says that conversion therapy is not possible and cannot happen. And they denounced it in 1974. So it's been 50 years. Unfortunately, a Project 2025, not to get political, does happen that allows conversion therapy to be reinstated in states across the country. So it throws out the research done by the American Psychological Association. Yeah. So maybe it's a timely story. That's right. Unfortunately.
I love the way that you present the face-to-face storytelling, and I feel like that really comes across when you're speaking. It feels like you're telling a story.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I felt like this was a little disjointed. I've never given a talk like this before. So thank you. So I had to really think about, like, what do I talk about? Like, we're all writers, right? We all have different journeys. So it's not, like I said before, my journey's special. So I had to really think about, like, what's important about this story. And so that was kind of hard for me, to be honest. So thank you for saying that, to think about what would be the most helpful. I think, yeah, but I think too, you know, like I said, I mean, I pretty much independently published it. I went through it and was put through the ringer. And then I had to decide, do I still publish it? And it was a story of not giving up and saying, yeah, I'm still going to do it. And I'm going to fight for the story because I've spent so much time on it that it can't just die right on the vine. It needs to be out there. And so that's what, I mean, that's what I say to people. The real story is not a lot of these accolades that I ended up getting. The real story is it was a self-published book that I fought for to get it into the market. And so maybe I could share more at some point about that if people are interested in how I got the book into the market. I mean, it was a lot of it was cold calling, like I said, and shooting my shot with people. But I think that's kind of the real story there, is that independent publishing you can still find your readers and find your home for it. And it can also lead to something maybe even a little bigger than that too. So I think when I went into the journey, I wouldn't have thought I would have independently published my memoir, right? Because after talking to a couple of editors and then having the courage to pitch agents and having interest, it was like the train, like I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to stop. And then all of a sudden to like hit that wall and for them to be like, well, yeah, thanks for riding along with us for a couple of years, but you can now get off the ride. I wasn't just going to, say, okay, and shelve that. I had to rethink, how can I find my readers and find a place for the story? And ultimately it ended up then getting traditionally published after that. So
I think that's really interesting that you made it traditionally published as by your time.
yeah.
Can you tell us?
Yeah, so my agent, and I would have never thought about this on my own. So my agent said to me, if you're going to publish it through the Facing Project Press, what contract do you use with your communities? And I said, well, it's kind of different because the communities are working with us, they're signing on, we train them on our model. They do it in part of that like contract that we say, we're training you, and this is the process, and you'll get a book out of it. So I'm like, that contract doesn't really matter. She was like, well, if we want to consider this like a real deal, we need a real contract. So she actually worked through that process with my board on setting it up, and she was very savvy. Like I remember my board chair, and I was not included in those conversations. They took me out of it because again, she said, we want to treat this like it's traditional. So they took me out of it. I remember my board chair saying to me like, wow, she's tough because they didn't want to give up the audio and TV rights. And she was like, this is not going to be a deal unless you let us keep the TV and audio rights. So what that means when we kept it, that means she and I kept those rights. And Facing Project Press did not have rights to it. They just had the right to publish the print book and the ebook. So she negotiated that contract with them and all of that. And my board chair signed it, and ultimately I signed it, and then she signed it as my agent. And when the book sells, royalties come into the Facing Project Press because we already have an arm and account set up for that. And my board chair essentially works on looking at the royalty reports on that. I did not get an advance, obviously, like for that, but I do get royalties. And so she worked the royalties in there. So then my board chair essentially looks at the royalty reports that come in, and based on my contract, which is pretty standard, or typically contracts for print are 10% royalty rate that you get as an author with a traditional contract. But she negotiated 15 with my board. Like my board chair was not kidding. They're like, wow, she's tough. So my board chair looks at it, and then however many copies I sold, I get 15% of the sales, and they cut me a check twice a year for it. I'm not making a ton of money off it. Like I said, it sold 1,000 copies. It's not like
Like all different places.
oh, really? Oh, well, thank you.
Are you going to be doing anything with those rights?
That becomes very tricky. So it all comes down to sales. So we had enough print sales that she was able to exploit the audio rights and get an audiobook publisher interested. But to get like TV and film rights, your book has to already be kind of a runaway success. And I don't think where my numbers are, I don't think that's viewed as a runaway success in that way. But people ask me that question all the time. Like, do you think it will be a movie? Like every author dreams that, right? Like the thing you write becomes a movie. I don't know if it ever will. And I was sharing with Janice and a couple of other people before, I've kind of got to the point where I'm really tired of talking about Hillbilly Queer. And I really just want to move on with my life. But when you write something that's out there in the world, like people are going to continue to ask you about it, so you have to talk about it. But really where I want to put my energy is on my new book and hoping that it goes somewhere. And it may not go somewhere. And then I have to decide, do I self-publish it again? Do I try to go that route? Do I try to pull in people and do the same kind of, song and dance around that? And maybe, right? I mean, maybe I'm okay with that. But I feel like I want to still shoot my shot. Like I said before, why not? But kind of my energy level is toward that right now. But people ask me, do you think? And I've never brought it up to her. I've never said like, hey, do you want to try to go exploit the TV or film rights? Because I know she'll say to me like, well, probably not. And it will be based on sales, essentially. Yeah.
What is she with a big agency? Or?
She's with MMQ Lit, which is in New York. Yeah. So she's an interesting person. She's Kathleen Glasgow's agent, who is a young adult, best-selling young adult writer. She wrote Girl in Pieces. Her new book that's coming out in the fall is called The Glass Girl. But our writing style is kind of similar. And so Julie was saying that about the YA stuff. So I've gotten to know Kathleen through this process, and Kathleen has agreed to blurb my new book, which is exciting. So what Julie has shared with me is her agency, every agent works independently, even though they're a part of an agency. So they make kind of their own rules on how many clients they sign a year, the genres they want to represent, and all of that. For Julie, she signs one new client about every 2 years. And she gets thousands of pitches a year. So it's hard. And that's why once I had her, I was like, I don't want to let her go, because I knew I went through that process trying to get an agent, and it's not easy. So I'm trying to keep her as long as I can. So it's this weird dance where I've heard people say like, well, they work for you. And while that's kind of true, they also choose you. You can't just choose an agent. So there's this weird power balance that you have to kind of decide the things that you want to push on and the things that you're just going to accept. So I'm not going to push TV or film rights and try to pressure her to get it out there, because I know what she'll say to me, and I just am not going to push that button, right? Yeah.
I'm gonna go back and then I'm gonna go forward.
Yeah.
Back is, did you ever go back to Richard and see if he was interested, and was he one of the 93 that rejected? And forward is, what are you gonna do next?
Yeah.
Do you have an idea?
So we did not go back to Richard, even though he was interested. So Julie, so this is the other thing with agents, and every agent is different. So I'm only speaking from my experience with Julie. Julie will only pitch and publish with the big five, except for the exception being this weird thing that she did with us for the Facing Project contract. She only goes after the big five. So for her, she would not have gone to Richard, because they don't view Wiley as one of the big five. But Wiley is still a top tier publisher. So in my eyes, I would view that as like top tier traditional publishing. But the publishing world in New York does not view Wiley in that same way. So Wiley was not on her list. Now, could I have said to her, like, I want to talk to Richard? But again, it's this weird, delicate balance where I'm like, what happens if I tell her, well, I want to go talk to editors on my own without you? Does that sever our relationship? So again, it was kind of this weird dance that I had to play, and ultimately decided not to talk to Richard. Do I regret that? I wonder. I don't know. I think about that sometimes. Like, would the book have had a different trajectory if Wiley would have published it? I don't know, but I can't think about what would have been, right? I'm happy with how it turned out, so that's okay with me. As far as what I'm working on next, beyond Miles from Nowhere, I'm guessing that's what you're asking. I cannot tell you all the details, but I do have another book outlined and the synopsis done for it that Julie has. And so going on submission, when you go on submission with a big five publisher, if they are interested in it, the question they will ask is, what else are they working on? And so you don't have to have the whole book written. If you already have your book that they're considering, you should have something if they ask that question that's like, here's a synopsis and an outline for the next idea that they're thinking about. That doesn't mean that if they don't like that idea, that it's a deal breaker. They may just do a 1-book deal with you. But if they like that idea, you'll see often when announcements are done on publishing, a 2-book deal, right? Or, sold in a 3-book deal. So that's when you have your synopsis and outline. Those things are sold. And when I say outline, I mean like a very simple outline. It's literally 1 page. So I do have that done. It's young adult. Again, being a bit of a genre vendor, it's a little more on the sci-fi side. So we'll see. Yeah, it's set in the future, not in the near future, 2030. Yeah, but I can't give you specifics because I don't have a deal yet, and I trust everyone, but also, I don't want to share the ins and outs of what the story's about. Yeah, but I do have book 3 in mind. Or you could consider it book 4 or 5, depending on how many times I rewrote Hillbilly Queer and tried to get that sold. Any questions from home? Are you all eating lunch and just kind of have your...
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Do you want to end this?